Commander Lyra Chun walked through the crystal corridors of Valorum Station and felt every alien eye turn toward Hirsch. Was not supposed to be here, and she knew it at 32 years old. She was the youngest officer to ever command a human destroyer. And she had fought in 3 major battles before most of these cadets had even learned to hold a weapon. But when the Galactic Coalition finally allowed humanity to join their ancient alliance, they had demanded something in return. They wanted a human officer to study at their most famous military academy. They wanted to observe one of these strange creatures from the deadly planet called Earth. The Admiralty back home had chosen Lyra specifically because she was small, standing at only 5 feet and 4 inches tall. She was considered the least threatening candidate available. The Coalition species had made their feelings about humans very clear over the past several decades. They were nervous. They were scared. They had watched humanity from afar, and what they had seen made them uncomfortable. The Cathari stood 8 feet tall with hard shells covering their bodies. The Drogan were massive reptilian creatures with claws that could tear through metal. The Villani had wings and could fly faster than most ships could track, and yet all of them looked at this small human woman with something close to fear in their many eyes. Director Morvan had greeted her on the first day with all 4 of his eyes blinking in a pattern. She did not recognize he was a Cathari, and he towered over her like a living statue. "You will be placed with the 3rd-year cadets," he had explained in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "They are the children of senators and generals and nobility, and they represent the future leadership of our coalition." Lyra had nodded politely and said nothing. She understood what he was really telling her. These were not just students. These were the sons and daughters of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. They were spoiled, and they were arrogant, and they believed themselves to be untouchable. She had met their type before on Earth. The only difference here was the scales and the claws and the extra limbs. As she walked to her assigned quarters, she heard the whispers following her like shadows. The translation device in her ear converted every alien language into words she could understand. "Look at how small she is," someone hissed. "How did her species even survive on their world? I heard they drank poison for fun." Another voice added something called alcohol and coffee. "Do not make eye contact with her," a third warned. "They are predators, and they see direct looks as a challenge to fight." Lyra kept her face calm and her expression neutral. She smiled when it seemed appropriate and nodded to the cadets who stared at her with curiosity or fear or disgust. She played the role she had been assigned perfectly. Humble exchange student, the eager learner, the harmless little human who just wanted to understand the ways of her galactic superiors. But behind her dark eyes, her mind was working constantly. She noticed everything. She noticed how the corridors were designed to favor larger species, and how the smaller cadets had to step aside or be trampled. She noticed how certain groups moved through the station like they owned it, while others pressed themselves against the walls to avoid attention. She noticed the hierarchy that nobody talked about, but everybody understood, and most importantly, she noticed Cadet Dexar was impossible to miss, standing 9 feet tall and covered in dark green scales. He was the largest Drogan she had ever seen. His family crest was displayed proudly on his uniform, and other cadets practically fell over themselves to get out of his way. He was the son of High General Dexar the Elder, who commanded one of the largest fleets in the Coalition. He was royalty in everything but official title, and he was a bully. Lyra saw it within hours of her arrival. She watched him shoulder a Villani cadet into a wall so hard that she heard something crack. The Villani cried out in pain and clutched at her wing, but Dexar just laughed and kept walking. His pack of followers laughed too. They were all Drogan, and they moved like a hunting party through the corridors of the academy, taking what they wanted, hurting who they pleased, answering to no one. The Perda instructor saw what happened. Lyra watched their reactions carefully. They looked away. Every single one of them pretended not to see the Villani cadet struggling to stand with her damaged wing. They pretended not to hear the cruel laughter echoing off the crystal walls. They did nothing because doing something would mean confronting the son of a high general. It would mean challenging one of the founding species of the coalition itself. The Drogon had been conquering worlds while humanity was still living in caves. They had built the coalition alongside the Cathari and the ancient Vellani queens. They believed themselves to be the natural rulers of the galaxy, and perhaps they had been once, but things were different now. Humanity had arrived. Lyra spent her first week watching and learning and saying very little. She attended classes on galactic strategy and coalition, law and the history of alien species. She trained in the practice yards with weapons she had never seen before. She ate strange food in the dining halls and answered the same questions over and over. Is it true that humans can eat almost anything? Is it true that your bones heal if they break? Is it true that you can run for hours without stopping? Yes and yes and yes, she told them all of it was true. Humans were strange creatures from a strange world. Their planet was heavier than most, with a gravity that crushed the weak. Their sun bombarded them with radiation that would kill other species. Their world was filled with predators and poisons and disasters that struck without warning, and somehow, against all odds, humanity had survived more than survived. They had conquered their world and then reached for the stars. The coalition did not know what to make of them, so they watched, they waited, they tried to understand these small, fierce creatures who should have died 1,000 times, but never did. And Lyra watched them right back. She saw the fear behind their curiosity. She saw the way they kept their distance, even when they smiled. She saw how they treated those they considered weak, and she began to form a plan, because Lyra Chun had not been sent here just to learn. She had been sent here to teach. The galaxy thought it understood strength. It thought that size and claws and ancient power were all that mattered. It thought that the strong could do whatever they wanted to the weak. Lyra intended to show them how wrong they were. But first, she needed to wait. She needed to watch. She needed to find the perfect moment. And she needed to meet the one person on this station who needed her help more than anyone else. That meeting would come soon enough. Until then, Commander Lyra Chun smiled and nodded and played her role perfectly. The harmless little human, the humble student, the smallest creature in a school full of giants. None of them suspected what she really was, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Lyra first saw Rin in the weapons training hall on her 8th day at the academy. The small creature stood alone at the far end of the room, trying to lift a practice blade that was clearly designed for species twice their size. Rin was a Mavari, and until that moment, Lyra had never even heard of their kind. They stood barely 4 feet tall, with smooth blue-gray skin that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light patterns of soft bioluminescence ran across their arms and face, and these patterns shifted and changed with their emotions in ways that Lyra found beautiful. Their eyes were large and dark, and filled with a gentle intelligence that reminded her of the dolphins back on Earth. The Mavari came from a peaceful world of shallow, warm seas and soft golden sunlight. They had no history of war. They had no tradition of warriors or soldiers or conquests. They had joined the Futuristic Coalition because they needed protection from the dangers of the galaxy. They were builders and thinkers and dreamers. They were not fighters, and yet here was Rin struggling with a training blade in a military academy surrounded by species that could crush them without effort. Lyra learned the reason later that same day. The Mavari government had decided that they needed representation in the coalition military. They believed that having even one officer of their kind might make the difference between their world being defended or abandoned if war ever came. So they had sent their best and brightest to Valorum Academy. They had sent Rin. It was, Lyra thought, one of the bravest and loneliest things she had ever heard. Rin had no allies here, no friends from their homeworld. No one who understood what it felt like to be small and soft in a galaxy that valued size and strength. Above all else, and Dexar had noticed the Drogon had a talent for finding the wiki, could smell vulnerability, the way a shark could smell blood in the water within days of Lyra's arrival. She watched him circle closer and closer to the small Mevery. He did not use his claws at first. That would have been too obvious. It would have left marks that even the most cowardly instructor could not ignore. Instead, he used words. He used his size and his voice and the weight of his family name. He used fear, like a weapon. Mavari should not be here, Dexar announced one afternoon in the training yard. He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, and the other cadets stopped what they were doing to watch. Rin stood frozen in place as the massive Drogon approached. Their bioluminescent patterns had gone completely dark. Lyra had learned that this was a fear response. It was an ancient instinct to become invisible when danger was near. But there was no hiding from Dexar. Your people are prey, the Drogon continued with a cruel smile spreading across his scaled face. You exist because the strong allow it and nothing more. Rin said nothing. They could not even look up at the creature towering over them. Perhaps we should put you out of your misery, Dexar suggested. And his followers hissed with laughter. It would be a mercy, really, and it would save you from embarrassing yourself when real combat begins. Lyra watched from across the yard with her hands clasped behind her back. Every muscle in her body wanted to move. Every instinct she had developed over years of command screamed at her to intervene. But she held herself still. Not yet, she told herself. Not yet. She needed to understand how this place worked. She needed to see how far things would go before anyone tried to stop them. She needed to know the rules before she could break them. Over the following weeks, she found her answer. Answer was that things could go very far and Dedran's equipment began to disappear. Their assignments were sabotaged in ways that were impossible to prove. They were partnered with Dexar's pack for training exercises, and they always came back with bruises. The bruises were carefully placed in spots that could be explained as training accidents. The instructors saw everything. They saw the missing equipment and the suspicious injuries, and the way Rin flinched whenever a Drogon came near. They did nothing. Because Dexar's father was a high general, because the Drogon were a founding species of the Coalition, because this was how power worked in the galaxy. The strong did what they wanted, and the weak suffered in silence. Lyra had seen this story before. She had seen it on Earth in schoolyards and boardrooms and battlefields. She had seen it play out 1,000 times, with different faces and different names, but the story was always the same, and she had always hated it. She began training with Rin in the quiet hours when most cadets were asleep. It started small, just a human exchange student offering to practice basic forms with a struggling cadet. If anyone asked, she was simply learning Coalition combat techniques from a fellow student. Nothing suspicious about that. Nothing threatening. But in those quiet sessions, she began to teach Rin things that were not in any Coalition manual. She taught them how to move efficiently despite their small size. She taught them how to use an opponent's strength against them. She taught them how to breathe through fear and find the calm center that existed inside every living creature. Why are you helping me? Rin asked one evening after a particularly difficult session. Their patterns were flickering with confusion, and their large eyes searched Lyra's face for answers. Because someone should, Lyra replied simply. Rin, look down at the floor. Dexar will notice eventually, and when he does, he will target you too. Lyra smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator that had been pretending to be prey. It was the smile of a commander who had destroyed enemy fleets and walked away without a scratch. I am counting on it, she said. Rin stared at her for a long moment. Something in their expression changed as they began to understand that the small human standing before them was not what she appeared to be. What are you? They whispered. Lyra considered the question carefully before answering. I am someone who learned a long time ago that cruelty should never go unanswered. She placed a hand on Rin's shoulder and felt him trembling. beneath her touch. Be patient, she told them. When the time is right, I'm going to teach this academy a lesson they will never forget. What kind of lesson? Lyra looked toward the viewport where distant stars burned like cold fire against the endless black, the kind that changes everything. She did not have to wait much longer. Thexar was growing bolder with each passing day. He could sense that something was different about the Mavari cadet Narration. Was not cowering as much as before, they were not. Going dark with fear every time he approached someone was helping them, and Thexar did not like it. Began watching Lyra more closely. She felt his eyes on her during classes and training sessions. She knew that he was trying to decide if the tiny human was worth his attention. Soon, he would make his move, and when he did, Lyra would be ready. The galaxy was about to learn what humanity was truly capable of, and Thexar was going to be the first lesson. The ritual of dominance was an ancient Drogan tradition that stretched back thousands of years to a time before space travel and galactic alliances. Was simple and brutal like the species that had created it. Any warrior could challenge another to single combat. The one who was challenged could not refuse without losing everything. Their rank would be stripped away, their privileges would be taken, their honor would be destroyed, and, in a society that valued strength above all else, a warrior without honor was nothing at all. The fight would continue until one party surrendered or was beaten so badly that they could not continue. The coalition had adopted this tradition into their academy rules because the Drogan had insisted upon it, and because no one wanted to argue with a species that had been conquering worlds since before most other civilizations existed. Lyra recognized immediately what this system really was. It was a tool designed to let the strong brutalize the weak with official permission. It was cruelty dressed up in the language of tradition and honor. It was exactly the kind of thing she had come here to destroy. The challenge came on a cold morning when the artificial lights of the station were still dim with the simulated dawn. Lyra was eating breakfast in the dining hall when she heard the commotion. Voices were rising somewhere beyond the crystalline walls. She heard gasps and excited murmurs spreading through the crowd like fire. She knew before she even stood up what was happening. She had been expecting it for days. By the time she reached the central courtyard, a crowd had already formed in a wide circle around two figures. Rin stood in the center, looking smaller than ever. Their bioluminescent patterns were throbbing wildly in a display of absolute terror. Their thin arms were wrapped around their body as if they were trying to make themselves disappear. Ixar towered over them like a mountain of scales and muscle and cruelty. His teeth were bared in what the Drogan called a smile. His claws clicked against each other with a sound like knives being sharpened. I have let this go on for far too long, he announced to the watching crowd. It is time to show everyone what happens when prey forgets its proper place. The instructors stood at the edges of the circle. They were watching like everyone else. They were not intervening. They would never intervene. This was tradition, because this was the Drogan way, because Thexar's father could destroy their careers with a single word. Rin looked around desperately, searching for any escape from the nightmare. Closing in around them, their eyes moved from face to face, finding only excitement or fear or cruel anticipation. No one was going to help them. No one ever did. And then their eyes found Lyra. The small human was pushing through the crowd with calm, deliberate steps. Her face showed no emotion at all. Her dark eyes were fixed on the center of the circle like a targeting system, locking onto its objective. I invoke the right of substitution. Lyra's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. The crowd went silent. Even Thexar stopped his posturing to stare at the tiny creature who had just spoken. Under Coalition Military Code, Section 7. Article 23. Lyra continued in the same calm tone. Any officer of equal or higher rank may stand in place of a challenged party. She stepped into the circle and stood between Rin and the massive Drogan, Commander Lyra Chen of the Terran Union Navy. she said. I believe that makes me the highest-ranking cadet present. She looked up at the XR without a trace of fear in her expression. So yes, she said me. Murmurs swept through the assembled crowd like waves across an ocean. The instructors exchanged uncertain glances with each other. No one had expected this. The human was supposed to be quiet and harmless. She was supposed to be here to learn from her galactic superiors. She was not supposed to challenge the son of a high general to single combat. XR's initial surprise quickly turned into amusement. He threw back his massive head and laughed with a sound like rocks grinding together. You cannot be serious, he said. I am Drogon, and we are the greatest warriors the galaxy has ever known. He spread his arms wide, displaying his claws and his muscles and his overwhelming size. My people conquered 12 star systems before your species. Learn to make fire, he continued. We have fought wars that lasted longer than your entire civilization has existed. He leaned down until his face was just inches from hers. And you think you can stand against me? Lyra began removing her uniform jacket with slow and deliberate movements. She folded it neatly and handed it to Rin, who took it with trembling hands. Then this should be easy for you, she said. Something changed in Nexar's expression. His amusement curdled into something darker and more dangerous. The tiny human was not showing any fear. She was not trying to negotiate or find an escape. She was dismissing him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. No one had ever treated him like this. No one had ever dared. I am going to hurt you, human, he growled with his voice dropping to a low rumble. Badly. He took a step closer, and his shadow fell over her like the darkness before a storm. I am going to make an example of you, he promised. I am going to break you so completely that no one will ever forget what they saw here today. Lyra finished stretching her arms and shoulders and neck. She rolled her wrists and settled into a stance that looked almost casual. Whenever you are ready, she said. Around them, the crowd had grown even larger. Word was spreading across the entire station through personal communicators and whispered messages. Cadets and instructors and even civilian staff members were pressing in to witness something unprecedented. Human was about to fight a Drogona creature from a species that most of the galaxy had dismissed as too small and too weak to matter. Was about to face one of the most feared warriors in known space betting pools were already forming in the back of the crowd. The odds against Lyra were astronomical. No one gave her any chance of survival. Only Rin saw something different. Only Rin had trained with her in the quiet hours and felt the impossible speed of her movements. Only Rin had looked into those dark eyes and seen the predator hiding behind the mask. The Mavari clutched Lyra's folded jacket against their chest and watched their friend prepare to fight a monster. For the first time since arriving at this terrible place, they felt something other than fear. They felt hope. The officiating instructor stepped forward to begin the formal proceedings. The ancient words were spoken. The ritual boundaries were confirmed, and then there was only silence as two warriors faced each other across the circle. The galaxy was about to learn something new about humanity. The lesson was about to begin. The combat circle was marked on the floor with luminescent paint that glowed a soft blue in the artificial light. 20 meters in diameter. It provided more than enough space for what Dexar had planned. He had reached with arms that could span half the distance between them. He had mass with a body that weighed more than 3 times what the human did. He had natural weapons with claws that could shear through combat armor like paper. The Drogon were apex predators, engineered by millions of years of evolution for one purpose. Kill. Lyra had done the math long before this moment arrived. She knew his advantages, and she had studied every record she could find about Drogon combat techniques. She had watched the XR train and memorized his favorite combinations. She had learned the weak points in Drogon anatomy that their armor of scales could not protect. She had prepared for this fight since the day she arrived at Valaraman. Now it was time. officiating instructor raised his hand, and the crowd held its breath. Begin. The XR surged forward with explosive speed. This was his signature move, and it had worked against every opponent he had ever faced. Close the distance immediately, overwhelm. With size and fury crush the enemy before they could even think about fighting back. His claws swept through the air in a wide arc that would have disemboweled a Velanet, would have shattered the shell of a Ketheriot, would have crushed a Mavari into broken pieces. But Lyra was not there. She had moved at the same instant. He did not backward where he expected her to go, but sideways and inward, slipping past the arc of his claws by a distance measured in centimeters. She was inside his guard before he even understood what had happened. Human evolution had created something unique in the galaxy on that deadly world called Earth. Everything had tried to kill the creatures that would become humanity predators. Faster than Drogon had hunted than prey, larger than starships had tried to crush. Them disasters had fallen from the sky and risen from the ground and swept across continents without warning, and through it, all humans had survived. They had developed reflexes that processed information faster than most species could track. They had developed muscles that could generate explosive force from compact frames. They had developed pattern recognition that could read an enemy's intentions before they even moved. Dexar was fast by Drogon standards. He was not fast by human standards. Lyra's FIST connected with a point just below his sternum. It was a nerve cluster that the Drogon used to regulate their breathing. It was not protected by scales. It was exactly where she had aimed. The impact was not loud, but the effect was immediate and devastating. Thexer's charge crumpled like a building with its foundation suddenly removed. His eyes went impossibly wide as his lungs forgot how to work. His momentum carried him forward. Another step before his legs buckled and he staggered sideways. Crowd was absolutely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Lyra had not even shifted from her position. She was simply standing there with her hands loose at her sides, watching the massive Drogon struggle to breathe. "That was your free shot," she said in a voice loud enough for only him to hear. "Submit now, and this ends here." Dexar heard her words through the roaring pain in his chest. For a single instant, something like fear flickered in his reptilian eyes, but then rage took over. Rage at the pain, rage at the humiliation, rage at this tiny, insignificant creature who dared to stand against him. Snarled with a sound that came from somewhere deep and primal, and launched himself at her again. This time he was faster. This time he used combinations that his family had perfected over generations. Claw strikes and tail sweeps and biting lunges that flowed together in patterns designed to overwhelm any defense. Each attack was faster than the last. Each combination came from a different angle. It was a display of Drogon martial arts that would have impressed even his father. Lyra flowed through it all like water through stones. She did not block his attacks because blocking would have shattered her. Human bones against his Drogon strengths. Did not retreat because that was what he expected. Instead, she moved. She slipped and ducked and twisted with movements so precise and economical that she seemed to be in two places at once. His claws passed through empty air again and again and again. His tail swept across ground she had already left. His jaw snapped shut on nothing at all. Humans called this threat assessment, and it was burned into their DNA from millions of years of survival. They could watch a predator move and know exactly where it would strike next. They could calculate angles and speeds and positions in the time between heartbeats. They could find the gaps in any attack pattern and exploit them without conscious thought. Tigzar was fast and strong and trained from birth to fight, but he was not a threat. "Stop playing with me," he roared in pure frustration. Lyra decided to oblige him. This time she did not slip aside. She stepped directly into his guard, inside the arc of his claws, where his size and reach meant nothing at all. Her palm strike caught him on the snout with enough force to rock his massive head. Backward, her knee drove into the same nerve cluster she had already weakened with her first strike as he folded. Forward from the pain, her elbow came down on the junction between his skull and his spine, not hard enough to kill, just hard enough to disconnect his brain from his body. Thexar collapsed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He hit the ground. With a crash that echoed off the crystalline walls, he was awake. He was aware, but he could not move a single muscle. The entire exchange had taken perhaps 3 seconds. Lyra stood over the fallen Drogon, and she was not even breathing hard. She looked at the crowd surrounding them. She looked at the instructors who had let this happen. She looked at the cadets who had laughed at the suffering of those weaker than themselves. "He will be fine," she said in a voice that carried across the silent courtyard. Temporary neural disruption with full recovery in about an hour. No one responded. "But let me be very clear about something," she continued. Her eyes moved across the assembled faces, and every single one of them looked away. "On my world, we evolved alongside creatures that could have destroyed us 1,000 times over." She looked down at Thexar, who was blinking up at her in confused terror, unable to comprehend what had happened to him. "We survived because we learned something that predator species often do not understand." She stepped back and clasped her hands behind her back. "Cruelty is not strength and domination is not power." She paused to let the words sink in. "I could have killed him on my first strike, and he never would have seen it coming." Her voice dropped to something almost gentle. "I chose not to." She looked at the crowd one more time. "That is power." The silence stretched on for a long moment before the first whispers began. The galaxy would never see humanity the same way again. The aftermath of the fight was complicated in ways that spread far beyond the walls of Valorum Academy. Within hours of Thexar's defeat, the footage had spread across every network in Coalition space. Billions of beings watched the tiny human commander dismantle one of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. They watched her move through his attacks like he was standing still. They watched her end the fight with 3 precise strikes that left him helpless on the ground. They watched her spare his life and explain exactly why she had done it, and they began to ask questions that had never been asked before. The official response came quickly. High General Lexo the Elder demanded that the human be expelled from the academy. He demanded that she be court-martialed and stripped of her rank, demanded her execution for the crime of humiliating his son in front of the entire galaxy. The Terran Union responded through their ambassadors with a message that was polite and firm and absolutely unyielding. Commander Chun had operated entirely within Coalition laws, had accepted a legal challenge. According to ancient Drogon tradition, she had fought with non-lethal force. Despite having every opportunity to kill, she had spared her opponent when she could have destroyed him. If the Drogon wished to dispute these facts, the ambassador suggested they were welcome to review the matter with humanity's legal team or with their fleet. The High General was wise enough to understand the message. Beneath the message, the matter was dropped, but the real changes happened far from the halls of power, where generals and ambassadors traded carefully worded threats. The real changes happened in the academy itself. Ren stood taller now. The Mavari cadet, who had spent months cowering in shadows, now walked through the corridors with their bioluminescent patterns glowing bright and steady. Other Mavari began to appear around them. Cadets that Lyra had not even known were enrolled at the academy emerged from their hiding places and gathered around the one who had been defended at community, formed built on the radical idea that the small did not have to fear the large, that the weak did not have to accept abuse from the strong, that someone would stand with them if they only had the courage to stand. Adolf Thexar returned to classes after his body recovered from the neural disruption. His scales had healed, and his muscles responded to his commands once again. But something else had been broken inside him, something that would never fully repair itself. It was not his body that Lyra had damaged with that final strike. It was his certainty, his absolute unshakable belief that he was the apex predator in any room he entered. His conviction that size and strength and ancient bloodlines made him untouchable. She had taken that from him with 3 movements that lasted less than a heartbeat each. Now, when he walked through the corridors, other cadets did not scramble to get out of his way. They stepped aside politely because that was proper. But they did not cower. They did not go dark with fear. They had seen the most powerful among them brought low by someone a third his size. They had learned that size was not destiny. We looked at Lyra sometimes. Across crowded rooms and training halls, she always met his gaze calmly with no anger or triumph in her expression. She simply looked at him as if he were any other being in the galaxy. Nothing more and nothing less. He always looked away first. I do not understand, Rin said one evening as they trained together in the practice rooms. Their patterns had taken on new colors since the fight, brighter and bolder with swirling configurations that Lyra had never seen before. You could have done that at any time, they continued. From the very first day you arrived, you could have stopped him. They looked up at her with those large, dark eyes. Why did you wait? Lyra considered the question carefully before answering, because it was never about beating him. She moved through a practice form as she spoke with her body, flowing through positions that seemed impossible for a creature of her size. If I had intervened too early, I would have been the scary human protecting you. She paused at the apex of the form, balanced on one foot with her arms extended. They would have feared me instead of him, and nothing would have really changed. She completed the movement and turned to face Rin. But by waiting until the right moment, I showed them something different. What? That he could be beaten, Lyra replied. That size does not determine victory, and that cruelty does not make you strong. She smiled at the small Mivari who had become her friend. Now they are not afraid of him anymore because they saw the truth with their own eyes. Rin was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had said. Is that what humanity learned on your world? Lyra thought about Earth. She thought about the millions of years of evolution and adaptation and survival. She thought about the ice ages that had frozen continents and the asteroids that had darkened skies. She thought about the predators and the diseases and the disasters that had tried to wipe out her ancestors. She thought about how humans had survived, not through strength alone, but through cooperation and creativity and the absolute refusal to give up. We learned many things, she said finally, but the most important lesson was this. She placed a hand on Rin's shoulder. Never mistake kindness for weakness. I do not understand. The most dangerous human is not the one who is trying to scare you, Lyra explained. It is not the one who threatens and postures and makes themselves look as big as possible. Then, what is it? The one who could destroy you but chooses not to. She let the words hang in the air for a moment, because that means they have something more important than power. What is more important than power? Lyra smiled with the same warm expression she had shown Rin on the day they first met, control years later when Rin commanded the Coalition's first fully integrated response fleet. They would look back on that conversation as the moment everything changed, not just for them, but for the entire galaxy. The fleet they commanded was unlike anything that had come before. Mivari served alongside Villani and Cathari, and even a few reformed Drogon who had learned to respect strength in all its forms. Humans were scattered throughout the ranks, teaching and learning and bridging gaps between species that had barely spoken to each other before. They called it the Unity Fleet, and its symbol was a small figure standing before a larger one, not in submission, but in equality. Historians would debate for centuries about exactly when the Coalition began to transform. Some pointed to the political reforms that followed the incident at Valarum. Others cited the cultural exchange programs that brought humans to every corner of the galaxy. But those who had been there on that day when Commander Lyra Chun stood over a fallen Drogon and spoke of power and choice knew the truth. It is started with a single lesson. A Lesson taught by a small human who could have killed her enemy, but chose to spare him. A lesson about what true strength really meant. Lyra Chun returned to Earth eventually and continued her career in the Terran Navy. She commanded task forces and won battles and did remarkable things that filled many classified files. But when people asked about her greatest accomplishment, she never talked about military victories. She always talked about Rinchi, talked about a small frightened cadet who had arrived in an academy full of giants with nothing but hope and determination. She talked about watching that cadet grow into an officer and then a commander and finally an admiral. She talked about the fleet that cadet now led and the thousands of lives they had saved across the galaxy. That is my legacy, she would say with pride shining in her dark eyes. Not the fight, but what came after. And across the stars in every corner of Coalition space beings of all sizes and shapes would tell stories about the human who had taught the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Cruelty is not strength. Domination is not power. And the smallest among us can change everything if they only have the courage to stand. That was the lesson of Commander Lyra Chun. That was the gift humanity brought to the stars. And the galaxy was forever changed because of it.